finish Ecclesiastes tonight for you. Start a new study. You can always tell how popular the subjects are as the attendance dwindles. But we're going to do the last two chapters of Ecclesiastes.
Ecclesiastes is a tough book.
Well, I told you it would be. And then we'll start. I'll start an introduction to Joseph, and then I'll continue at Sunday morning because I'm teaching for Roger, and then we'll begin in earnest next Wednesday night. We'll really get to begin to examine Joseph's life. So, chapter 11, then in Ecclesiastes, we continue with the this motif, this picture of people that are do-gooders, people that are moral in their life. And in verse 1 it says, "Cast your bread upon the waters, and you will be filled. You will find it after many days." And then in verse 2 it says, "Give a serving to 7 and also to 8, for you do not know what evil will be on earth." That's kind of the idea there, is that do good, and when you do good for a lot, because if you do good for a lot, when you need help, you'll get help back. But if you don't do that with a proper heart, you shouldn't do it at all. In Luke 16, if you want to turn over to Luke 16, you can if you want to with me. There's the parable of the unjust steward. Have you ever wondered about the unjust steward? He was unjust. But Jesus has just finished talking about the prodigal. Okay? And then he goes into this next parable in Luke 16. He says, he also said to his disciples, "There was a certain rich man who had a steward, and an accusation was brought to him that this man was wasting his goods. So he called him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Give an account of your stewardship, for you can no longer be steward.' And the steward's like the top servant. Then the steward said within himself, 'What shall I do? For my master is taking the stewardship away from me. I cannot dig.'" In other words, he says, "I can't do labor," because I've been the head steward for a long time, and I like that cush job. So and he says, "I'm ashamed to beg. I have resolved what to do, that when I am put out of the stewardship, they may receive me into their houses." So what he says is, I've got a plan so that when he fires me, I'll be able to go to people's houses and they'll take care of me. So then he says, "So he called every one of his master's debtors to him and said to the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' And he said, 100 measures of oil. So he said to him, 'Take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. So he's reducing this guy's bill to his master. Then he said to another, "And how much do you owe?" And he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said to him, "Take your bill and write 80. So now the part I want you to see that's most important is the next verse. "So the master commended the unjust steward because he had dealt shrewdly." In other words, the master was a crook too. And so, "For the sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light." Okay? So the master says, you still don't get your job back, but you're a pretty good conniver. So that's kind of the idea behind what we saw in Ecclesiastes. You see a lot of this idea that this idea of setting yourself up for what we would consider to be success. Look at verse 3. "If the clouds are full of rain, then empty themselves upon the earth, and if a tree falls to the south or to the north, in a place where the tree falls, there it shall lie." That's that idea of what will be, will be. If something's going to fall, something's going to fall. If if the clouds are full of rain and they empty themselves, all those things are just by chance, by circumstance. And then verse 4, he who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. If you're going to sow, you better wait until there's no wind. If you want to reap harvest, if you're going to have a good harvest, you better hope that you get rain. Verse 5, as you do not know what is the way of the wind, nobody knows what the way of the wind is. Even though we've learned a lot about some things, there's still some things we don't really understand. We don't really understand how a fetus is formed entirely. That's still a mystery. There's still scientific mysteries today. But the greatest mystery, in my mind, is probably how we're spiritually reborn. That would be the greatest mystery. How is it that God is able in one instance to take a sinner and then to change that person entirely into someone else? It's the idea. Somebody look at John 3:8 for me and read that for us. It's kind of the same idea here with this idea of the wind. And John 3:8.
The wind blows wherever it pleases. You hear its sound, but you cannot tell where it comes from or where it is going. So it is with everyone who is born of the Spirit.
Yeah. So kind of that idea that these things happen. We don't know how they happen, but I would say that's the greatest mystery. Because we take a lot of things for granted. We trust in a lot of things just because we trust in them. Like when you came in today, you didn't know anything about those chairs. You didn't know who made them. You didn't know where they were made, but you trust that they'll hold up your weight. There's some things that we just don't know, but we need to trust in them, is the point I'm trying to make, okay? And then verses 7 and 8 say, it says, I want to skip over there, truly the light is sweet and it is pleasant for the eyes to behold the sun. But if a man lives many years and rejoices in them, let him remember the days of darkness, for they will be many. All that is coming is vanity, okay? So the idea of as you get older, truly the light is sweet, is pleasant for the eyes to behold. But if a man if he lives many years, and then it says, let him remember the days of darkness. As you get older, things change for you. And then look at 9 and 10. Rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes. But know that for all these, God will bring you into judgment. Okay? God will bring you into judgment. Notice how that verse begins with the word rejoice, and it ends with the word judgment. In verse 9, I'm talking about, begins with rejoice and ends with judgment. And those two, they're kind of opposed to each other. But the idea would be for us as Christians is to enjoy life without iniquity in our lives. So there has to be a balance in the believer's life. You can't be reckless. You can't be sinful. You have to, a lot of things that some Christians, when they get saved, they give up pleasure. Life is supposed to be pleasurable, You shouldn't have to give up pleasure. And you can experience pleasure in your faith and in your obedience. Because what Solomon says, both in Proverbs and in Ecclesiastes, is that really true satisfaction is a gift from whom? It's a gift from God. So then we come to the last last chapter of Ecclesiastes. And, I've tried to present this as, in your outline, it shows all these areas of experimentation where I've tried to present the idea that Solomon is trying to figure out a way, do any of these really satisfy you? And as he examines each one of these different areas, he sees that nothing under the sun will satisfy man. Okay? It has to be something above the sun. It has to be God. Our society in the last 20, 30 years, we've started this deal where we want to return to nature. They're not allowing some of the farmers to have any water in California, so that little schmelt. What is a schmelt, anyways? Cross between a snake and a melt. A schmelt.
Sounds Jewish.
But they won't, they're not letting them because they don't want that little fish to die. And that was one of the things, Solomon looked at was nature, science. He looked at all these philosophy, materialism. He looked at religion, ritualism. He looked at we've talked about him looking at this do-gooder, this moral person. And he kind of now makes a summation. Most people believe that Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes later in his life. So he kind of starts summarizing here in chapter 12. If you look at verse 1, it says, "Remember now your Creator in the days of your youth, before the difficult days come, and the years draw near when you say, I have no pleasure in them." In them means in the years. So what Solomon is saying, remember now your Creator, he's saying, get back to God, okay? And hopefully while you were young, you made a decision for God. So now he's going to start painting a picture for you of our old age. Verse 2. "While the sun and the light, the moon and the stars are not darkened, and the clouds do not return after the rain." The sun and the moon, are the sun and the moon and the stars, are those things darkened? No. But when you get older, they don't look quite as bright. Okay, is what I think he's saying. And the idea of the clouds return after the rain is an idea that bad things can happen. The rain here is like a reference to something bad, and then the clouds can come right back and it can happen again. Bad things can happen in your life repetitively, okay? Verse 3, "In the day when the keepers of the house tremble," you know what the keepers of the house are? Your legs, yeah. The keepers of the house, like the stilts of a home, when they begin to tremble, that's what he's talking about. "And the strong men bow down," okay? The strong men bow down. A lot of people with that refers to shoulders, or being bent over. "When the grinders cease because they are few," you know what those are, don't you? The grinders. "And those that look through the windows grow dim." What's that? Your eye. Your eyes. Old Solomon, he's got such an optimistic point of view. And after you read it, after you study this stuff, I feel worse sometimes. Verse 4, "When the doors are shut in the streets and the sound of the grinding is low, when one rises up at the sound of a bird and all the daughters of music are brought low, when the doors shall be shut in the streets and the sound of the grinding is low." He's talking about your hearing, okay? You can't hear as well. What? Oh. And then he says, and he shall rise, what's it say? One rises up at the guess that has to do with, you used to rise up at the sound of a bird, but now you don't. Now you can't even hear the bird.
You wake up to go to the bathroom.
And then all the daughters of the music shall be brought low. As you get older, it gets harder and harder to sing. And that's one thing I always envied about Homer. He's almost 80, he's still singing. But just other ideas on old age. Verse 5. Also they are afraid of height and of terrors in the way. When the almond tree blossoms, that grasshopper is a burden, and desire fails, for man goes to his eternal home, and the mourners go about the streets. I guess afraid of heights. I don't. I used to just climb up on ladders and think nothing of it. I remember one time I fell off a ladder that way, but I didn't get too hurt. And fears shall be in the way. There's things that you once did that you don't enjoy doing anymore. Why is the almond tree still? Why shall the almond tree flourish? You know what the leaves of an almond tree are? White hair. That's what he's talking about. And then some of us have a dual problem: white hair and the absence of hair as it takes leave. Can you imagine a grasshopper being a burden? But when you get old, many little things can become a burden. Like getting down on the floor and looking underneath the sofa for baby Juan's toys. Man, I can't get back that stuff underneath that sofa. Yeah, getting back up, man, that's even worse. And then that last part is the idea of, I think, for man goes to his eternal home, and the mourners go about the streets. I think that's the idea that death is near. Verse 6, remember your Creator. So he's asked him now to do that twice, in verse 1 and in verse 6. And you may not have, do you have remember your Creator in your version? I don't know if the King James has it twice. It may not. And it talks about the silver cord, which is what?
Cord of life.
Yeah, or the spinal cord, maybe. The golden bowl. That's your peanut up here. The gold in your head. The golden bowl might be broken. The brain might not function as well. The pitcher shattered at a fountain. Most people, the pitcher is the lungs, hold air. But if they're shattered, what happens? They no longer hold air. Whoever that is, they don't know who I am, or they wouldn't be calling me. So the pitcher is the lungs, the wheel, most people would say is the heart, okay? The wheel is broken at the cistern, meaning that it's not functioning the way it should. It's no longer pumping blood through the body. So all of this is just a picture of the deterioration of old age. Really heartwarming. Glad Margaret's not here. I was worried about teaching this with her here. Then verse 7, then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. A lot of people use some of these verses out of Ecclesiastes to support soul sleep. I don't think they read that verse, because that verse refutes soul sleep. And then verse 8, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity. So that's the idea. Life is empty. Vanity is vanity. Here's a little poem from, it's an unknown author. When I was a child, I laughed and wept, and time crept. When I was a youth, I dreamed and talked, time walked. When I became a full-grown man, time ran. still I daily grew, time flew. Soon I shall find in traveling on that time is gone. Unknown author. And Psalm 90:12 teaches, that's the psalm that talks about numbering your days. And it tells you to number your days so that you can apply wisdom to your heart. Psalm 90:12. So kind of important. And then 9, 10, and 11, he says the whole. So here we really have the summation. He says, and moreover, because the preacher was wise, he still taught the people knowledge. Yes, he pondered and sought out and set in order many proverbs. The preacher sought to find acceptable words, and what was written was upright words of truth. Okay? The words of the wise are like goads, and the words of scholars are like well-driven nails given by one shepherd. Okay? So this is where he's giving his final advice. So he's giving you advice in regards to wisdom. What do you think of the idea of the goads and the well-driven nails? Do you know what a goad is?
Make an ox.
It's a stick with a sharp end. The idea is a shepherd. These are like shepherd's tool. When you have a goad, you can use a goad. Well, you can move a reluctant animal with a goad.
Would be a hot shot.
Yeah, kind of like a hot shot. Yeah, an old-time hot shot. And then the other one, then you have these well-driven nails. The idea behind well-driven nails, a preacher can goad. God can goad a people, and then he can, because they're goaded and they move and they learn and they figure things out, they can be secure in a place of well-driven nails, like a stable, okay, like a corral. So the idea behind goads and well-driven nails is that they end up providing you with wisdom. All right? And then verse 12 says, and further, my son, be admonished by these, of making many books there is no end, and much study is wearisome to the flesh. Okay? And really, there's one, if you're going to major in a book, you should major in God's book. There's a lot of books you can read. You can go to a Christian bookstore and find something about everything. But you can also find something about everything in the Word of God. Then in 13, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. Okay? Fear God, keep his commandments. And then in 14, for God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether it be good or bad. All right? So, what's the solution to the problems that are under the sun?
Fear God and obey his commands.
Amen. Jesus Christ, that would be the solution. Okay. So on the back side of your outline, you have an outline that begins a study of Joseph. I'll just go through a little bit of this. Most people are fully aware of Joseph. Joseph was a favored son. Okay. He was a dreamer, was he not? He was a slave who was betrayed. Okay. He ended up being a prisoner. He became in essence, was a wise man of Egypt. He was loyal. He was faithful. He was worshipful. He was very honest. Okay. And that's kind of Joseph. If I asked you, are there any other words that you would use to describe Joseph? What words would you use?
You pretty much use them.
Pardon me?
You pretty much use them.
Pretty much used. So that's kind of Joseph in a nutshell. But the thing about a nutshell, you got to make sure you don't miss the nut that's inside the nutshell. So, and that's what I'm going to try to talk about. I'm going to try to look at his life in real depth, because I think there's some things we can learn. Joseph was a blessed man. He was blessed with power. He was blessed with wealth, blessed with children and prestige. But all of those things were when? At the end of the story. The other part, the beginning of the story wasn't that great. Sometimes we look at people and we think, well, I can see why they're faithful. Look at how good their life is. But what the thing is that we don't know the rest of the story. When Joseph's life began during when he was in Egypt, he was betrayed, he was shamed, he was forgotten. And when he was going through all that, did he know who he was going to become? No, he didn't have any idea who he was going to become. So, as we begin to look at Joseph's life, I want you to try to put aside any preconceived ideas you might have about his life. Remember, as a little boy, how was Joseph treated by his brothers? Poorly. In fact, they ignored him most of the time. How was he treated by his parents? He was spoiled rotten. Remember what happened? He ended up, who put him in the pit? His brothers. So we're going to look at his life when he's put in the pit, when he gets put in a slave caravan and taken to Egypt, when he gets sold on the auction block, okay? In all this time, Joseph has a very good idea of who and how he is supposed to be. So we're going to see his struggles with that. We're going to feel him struggle for purity as he sits in a dungeon in Egypt. And then at the end, we'll see him as he rises to power, as he lives. So I think I put this in the outline. I want us to learn how Joseph, even in his circumstances as a young man, was able to learn to live a life full of grace and forgiveness. All right? I think that's the greatest thing that he can show us. And so let me begin here. You know me, I'm going to begin before Joseph, because that's just the way I think. Somebody asked me if I would teach a class in systematic theology. If I ever taught a class in systematic theology, we would all pass on in this room, because I would never finish. How many of you know what systematic theology is? It's taking one thought and taking it from A to Z, like sin, from Genesis to Revelation. Salvation, from Genesis to Revelation. You just, most classes, systematic theology in most seminaries is a 4-year course. And usually you teach your subject matter either by topics, you group the good ones with the bad ones, or a lot of people teach them alphabetically. But I say that just so you'll understand where I'm going to start here. How many of you wish you were born? Does anybody here wish that they had been born to different parents? Come on now. Yeah? Okay, now.
I was raised with a father who said that he hated kids, and he did that right to us.
Yeah, I do too.
Okay. And you know, my family was pretty much dysfunctional. My mother left when I was young, and my dad drank a lot after she left to cope with life. But there's one thing I did understand, I think, as a young person, is that there weren't really a lot of normal people around, you know. At least where I grew up, there wasn't. It was my best friend, Fudgy. His name was called Fudgy. His name was Albert Corona. Fudgy, he didn't have a dad. His dad was a policeman who had been killed in the line of duty. A lot of our other friends. And in fact, the ones that were probably quote unquote normal were the unusual ones where I grew up. So, but you know, everybody has embarrassing relatives. Do you have any embarrassing relatives? Yeah, I had an uncle, Uncle Dan. He had served in World War II, and he had come back from the war, and he was, but they called it then, he was shell-shocked. And I remember as a little kid, 3, 4 years old, playing checkers with Uncle Dan, and Uncle Dan would bet me, whoever wins get to pinch the other guy. Well, he always won, and I would end, my arms would be back and blue, and my mother would be mad at Uncle Dan. And I remember taking him to Boston. We grew up in Rhode Island. I started to grow up in Rhode Island, and we used to take him to the psychiatric hospital at the VA because he was crazy. I remember one morning waking up and going outside, and my father's car had been taken apart, and it was laying all across the front yard. Uncle Dan had took it apart. He had been out there all night with a light, and he took the whole car apart. And he had to put it back together. He was able to do both, but he wasn't quite normal. So, you know, and most families have secrets. I don't know what your family's secrets might be. Most families have idiosyncrasies. They have different problems. And, you know, family problems have been heightened in the last few decades. We have blended families now. We have the word dysfunctional never used to be used in regards to a family. But Joseph, he gives us a new dimension. When you think of blended families and dysfunctional families, when you get a complete picture of his family, we're going to see how blended and dysfunctional they were. So we're going to look at his ancestry as we begin this study. And who were Joseph's great-grandparents? Abraham and Sarah. And his grandparents would have been Isaac and Rebekah. And his parents, Jacob and Rachel. So that's a pretty good family tree. Biblically speaking, if you come from, think of that family tree. So if that's your family tree, you should have no problems in life, correct? You know, you've got Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You shouldn't have any troubles in life. But he had a lot of troubles in life. And that's one thing good about the Bible. You know, the Bible records the good, the bad, and the ugly. They're all in there, and they're all there for us to understand. So we're going to look at his life, and we're going to look about how his decisions, his brothers, others' decisions, his forefathers' decisions, how all of those things changed and made his life different. So we're going to start with Abraham and Sarah. And have you ever tried to help God, like in your prayers? Have you ever tried to sway God to get him to tell you what you want him to tell you? Or have you ever prayed and then tried to make the circumstances appear that God's leading you in in a certain direction when he's really not leading you in that direction? Have you ever tried to bend the will of God so that it will work out according to your plans rather than his plans? Have you ever stretched the facts or sidestepped an issue to, and this is a good one for Christians, have you ever tried to sidestep an issue to avoid an unpleasant situation? Like with family or friends, when you should have said something, and rather than saying something, you didn't say something? Those are tactful ways to use, those are tactful ways to say those things. You could use other words like deceit or manipulating or controlling. But it's safe to say that a lot of people, most of us, I'll say myself, have tried to manipulate situations sometimes to their own, for their own good rather than where they might see God want them to go. And Abraham and Sarah had that problem in their lives. Known originally as Abram and Sarai, or Sarah, they were considered, we consider them people of great faith, correct? Yeah, Abraham is considered a man of great faith. But at times their faith appeared to be pretty much non-existent. And there's times that my faith might waver too. You might be trusting God day one, and by day two you're fretting, and by day three you're worrying. But Abraham and Sarah did, as Abraham and Sarah walked with God, they did come to places where their faith was preeminent in their life. And I want you to understand, if say Abraham and Sarah had problems with their faith in their lives at times, it's not ridiculous for us to think that we might have problems with our faith at times. Look at Genesis 12. That's where we're going to start this study. Is Genesis 12, 1 through 3. If you'll, when you get there, if somebody will read that. Genesis 12, 1 through 3.
Then the Lord told Abram, leave your country, your relatives, and your father's house, and go to the land that I will show you. I will cause you to become the father of a great nation. I will bless you to make you famous, and I will make you a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you, and curse those who curse you. All families of the earth will be blessed through you.
Okay. Abram meant high father, but the Lord ends up changing his name to Abraham, which means the father of a multitude. And Sarah's name, both of Sarah's names mean princess. Some people try to read more into her first name, but really it's just princess. So in those first 3 verses of Genesis 12, there's 7 elements of God's promise to Abraham. In those 3 verses, he promises him 7 things. Okay? What's the first one? I'll make you into a great nation. What's the second one? I will bless you. What's the third one? Make your name a great name. And you shall be, the next one is, you shall be a blessing. He's going to make him a blessing. What's the next one? He's going to bless those who bless him. And what's the next one? He's going to curse those that curse him. And then in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So, who's talking? Who's making the promises? So, and now the Lord had said to Abram. Do you think Abram knew who was talking to him?
Yes.
Okay. So God has identified himself to Abram, and he speaks to him, and he tells him, I've got a plan for your life, Abram. And he gives him his word, okay? It's a promise of fulfillment is what it is. And what does Abram have to do to realize this promise?
Well, obey, leave your country and stuff.
Yeah. Really, all he has to do is leave and wait. Pretty simple instructions. Go do this, and then I'm going to promise you all this stuff. But Abram, how old is Abram? About, most would say around 75 years old. His wife, probably 10 years younger, 65, his barren wife. And, life expectancy was longer there. But as we go through the story of Abram, he began to wonder about these promises. How am I going to be a great nation when I don't have any children? How am I going to be a blessing to anyone? How are all these things going to happen when nothing has happened yet? So why did God make Abram wait? It's one of my favorite phrases. Because God wants to be utterly obvious in your life. Larry Reninsky, a Christian psychiatrist in Oklahoma City. God wants to be utterly obvious in your life. When God moves, he wants to make sure that other people, I was talking to Gene and Dan the other day about this. When God moves, he wants to make sure that everybody knows what? It's God. He wants people to know. He doesn't want there to be any opportunity for anyone else to lay claim upon his movement. So what happens? All these years pass by, and Abram and Sarah are still waiting, and they're waiting, but God has spoken the promises. But they're waiting, and they're waiting. They moved a long time ago. Abram and Sarah and their nephew Lot. They took their servants and their flocks, and they went to Egypt. Why did they go to Egypt?
Famine.
There was a famine, so they sought relief in Egypt. And so, did God know that Abram was going to go to Egypt? Yeah. So what does he do? What does he do to Abram in Egypt? He sets him up for his first faith test. Okay? Because God has made a promise, all right? You're going to be all of these things. A great nation, all of these things. But when Abram got to Egypt, what was his fear?
Sarah,
What about it?
he pretended that Sarah was his sister, right?
Yeah, why?
Because he was afraid they would kill him or his wife, right?
So God's promised you that you're going to be the father of a great nation. Should you be worried about being killed? Should you?
No.
Let's figure it like that. So what Abram does is he resorts to deceit. Instead of turning to God for guidance and protection, when he's confronted with his dilemma, he tries to manipulate the people and the circumstances. Is Abram a believer?
Yes.
Yeah. he's a picture of faith in the Word. But he finds himself in a sticky wicket, and he decides, I'm going to manipulate the people and the circumstances around me. God had promised to make him a great nation and bless the world through his descendants, and yet he gets to Egypt, and he's sure that they're going to kill him so that they can have his wife. Would that have fulfilled God's promise? No. So, so he's hoping that what he has proposed will solve his problem. How? Huh? How did he think that his actions would solve his problem?
Well, it was up to him to save the day instead of God.
So when he deceived the Egyptians, who else do you think deceived the Egyptians? Everybody. He had to get his whole family to help him, right? His wife, his nephew, everybody would have had to become party to his deceit. So he presents her as his sister rather than his wife, and as the head of the household, he gets everybody else to join in his deception. And so here's the picture. I want you to learn from me, family members. Rather than believing God's promises, I'm going to teach you how to be deceitful. That's what he taught them. That's what he taught them. That's what he showed them. So he allowed fear, and his fear caused him to take what we would probably say is a cowardly way out. Now I read some commentarians that say Abram didn't really lie because Sarah was his half-sister. Well, I'm not going to go there.
I haven't read that in Scripture.
Yeah, they used Genesis 20, 11, and 12 to rectify that. But Abram's intent was his intent was a wrong intent. He wanted to give a wrong impression by presenting the truth in a misleading way. He purposed to deceive. And God will hold you accountable when you purpose to deceive. Hebrews 4:12, for the word of God is living and active. It says it judges your thoughts and your attitudes. Okay? The intentions of your heart, I think, is the phrase in that verse. So Pharaoh was so delighted with Sarah, he rewarded Abram with a bunch of stuff. He gave him livestock and servants. So, in many ways, Abram actually benefited from his lie. His what he probably thought was a small deceit, and it affects all his family around him, and it has long-lasting consequences. And I'll talk about those long-lasting consequences when we come back next week. Okay? But remember. Have you ever heard people use the phrase a half-truth? Well, it's a half-truth. The only thing about that phrase is a half-truth is a whole lie. So, half-truths don't make it. Okay. Any thoughts? Anybody? See, I have my little book. It says it's about more than just a pretty coat. And I put COAT, and it's a different color. It's a coat of many colors. I'm just so pleased with myself. A simple mind. It's a terrible thing to waste. Let's stand.